The cedar plank is specifically something that is flat, so that the haughtiness that allowed the person to initially gossip about other people is now gone, and he will be more humble than to allow himself to do that. The scarlet thread is a reference to the reddening of the person's face who was embarrassed because of this gossiper's speaking of him. And the water from a live stream, specifically a stream that is alive, what's called living waters, is to rectify the fact that there was, in essence, a kind of a killing that occurred when he, again, embarrassed others. The individual also shaved his entire body. After a 7-day wait, the person shaves again and brings 3 animals and an oil offering to the temple. The second aliyah. The priest processes the offerings in the manner prescribed in this section. With this, the purification process is completed. We'll note that the main kind of act that the Kohen does onto or to the person that is being purified is imbibing or placing upon him oil. He is to place oil in 3 places: his right earlobe, his right thumb, and his right big toe. In each of those places, we actually divide the entire body: the head, the upper body, and the lower body. And even though there is a middle, right, and left to all 3 of those, the right is where that oil is placed, specifically on the right earlobe, on the right thumb, and on the right big toe. The reason for that is that the very idea of purification comes from divine kindness. And Jewish mysticism teaches us that kindness emanates from the right side. And so, in order to connect those two, in order to, in essence, effectuate this purification on a spiritual level, we access that divine kindness from the right side. The third aliyah. If the individual suffering from tsaras cannot afford the above sacrifices, 2 birds can be substituted for 2 of the animals. This section describes the slightly different purification process reserved for the impoverished person. The fourth aliyah. Homes too can be afflicted with tsaras. Here, the verse says that when you enter the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to you as a possession, and I will place tsaras, this disease, in the houses of the land of your possession. Except that the word for place is in fact not as good of a translation. The technical or denotational translation is "and I will give," vinosati, like noisein ha-Torah, giver of the Torah. And that's a little strange because this seems a very negative experience, inconvenient to say the least, if not embarrassing, if not off-putting. Why in the world would this be termed a gift? There is a word in Hebrew for place, and I shall place, visamti. I shall make, ve'osisi. Doesn't use those words. It says vinosati, and I will gift the disease of tsaras on the houses of the land of your possession. The sages explain that in preparation for being defeated or being overrun, one of the 7 nations that initially lived in the land of Canaan, the Amorites, had a plan. They did not have any misinterpretations or kind of foolish ideas about the power of the Jewish people. They saw that Egypt fell to the Jewish people, that Amalek fell to the Jewish people, and that many other nations along the way, especially towards the end of our 40 years in the desert, fell to the Jewish people before we were to enter the land of Israel. Nevertheless, they thought that we are going to get overrun, we're therefore going to escape, but we're going to regroup, and we're going to come back and retake all of the land, all of our land, that the Jewish people are initially going to be successful in taking from us. rather than schlepping all of their stuff in order to not lose it, and then in order to bring it back, they actually hid their jewels and precious metals into the walls of the houses that they were about to leave. That way, no one would get to them. And then when they came back, obviously, they would be able to re-access all of that wealth. When tsaras, as we'll read in a second, occurs in the walls of a house, at the very least, the stones that are affected by that disease, that are discolored from the disease, have to be removed. And that would, of course, open the walls of the house. And so, by virtue of having tsaras in the house or on the house, the Jewish people, once, of course, they've entered the land of Israel, would then have to open that wall and they would get to that treasure. For that reason, it was termed a gift. That's all very nice and good for tsaras on the house. But the reality is that tsaras also exists on clothing and it also exists on skin. And even though here the terminology is gifting the disease of tsaras onto the houses of the land of your possession, it's overall the same disease. And so if there is a gift element to tsaras on the home, there also is somewhat a gift element to all of the other forms of tsaras. What about that? There's no treasure that I get from having tsaras on my elbow. The idea of any negative occurrence, any negative expression coming from God in and of itself needs explanation. The verse tells us, and even logic dictates, that if God is the ultimate goodness, then nothing negative really ever comes from him. If something is experienced as negative, that might be the case on a superficial level, but if you look a little bit deeper, you'll recognize that in fact it's a positive. When a person sins, there is a negative effect to the world and to himself on both the spiritual and physical level that stems from that sin. Most times, that negative effect is not immediately seen. Part of living in a world that conceals divinity, in order to allow us to have free choice and to choose God, is that it is not conspicuous that we must choose what God wants, because then it becomes kind of a no-brainer, and then there's not much of a choice, and then there's not much of serving God. When, on the other hand, it's inconspicuous whether there's the positive result of a positive choice or the negative result of a negative choice, and nevertheless, we choose positively, we choose according to God's will, and we serve God that way, that is genuine service. However, when a person would gossip, for example, or other things that also caused tsaras back in the day, and the negative result of those choices would manifest themselves in tsaras, which is conspicuous, it's inescapable, you have to face the music, as it were, that in and of itself is a gift. Because the person has to realize then that he is doing something wrong and has to choose to serve God, and by virtue of recognizing that he was wrong, changing his ways and repenting, that in fact is a gift. With the conspicuous nature of tsaras, it's a gift that now I am able to kind of make sure that I'm on the right path. And so, in general terms as well, tsaras should be considered a gift, and by extension, really all things that appear to be negative from God. If stones on a home become discolored, acquiring a strong red or green pigment, a priest is summoned. When the person who has this house and sees the discoloration thinks that he might have tsaras, he's supposed to tell the Kohen, something like a disease of tsaras I have on my house. This is the requirement. even if he is a person who knows the laws of tzaras himself, even if he is more experienced than the Kohen who will come to eventually adjudicate his house. In any and all instances, even if it's patently obvious, he is to say only that he has like a disease of tzaras, not that he has tzaras. On the simple level, this is because only the Kohen is allowed to decide, to adjudicate whether it's a person who might have tzaras, a garment that might have tzaras, in this case, a house that has tzaras. Only a Kohen is allowed to make that distinction, to make that adjudication, because there are parameters, there are implications to proclaiming such a thing. Tzaras, again, mostly was caused by gossip. To say that a person's home or garment or his skin is afflicted with tzaras is to, in fact, proclaim that this person caused strife amongst the Jewish people. And that kind of distinction, that kind of adjudication cannot be taken lightly. And therefore it is exclusively given as a responsibility, but also as the role of the Kohen. Remember that any Kohen in any generation is going to be a direct patrilineal descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Aaron, the Kohen, was known and is described by our sages as loving peace, pursuing peace, making peace between people who are arguing. And so only someone with that kind of sensitivity towards peace and the necessity of peace can really be trusted to make that distinction. Anyone else is not. In a deeper sense as well, the commentaries explain that this is a lesson in how to speak positively. Even again, if we are talking about someone who is an expert in the field of tzaras, but he himself is not a Kohen, on his home, he sees what he clearly knows and correctly identifies as tzaras. He is not allowed to say, I have tzaras, he says, or at my house, he says, like tzaras, only like. If, as much as possible, a person should speak positively. And to say that something is outright tzaras is obviously more negative than to say like. And so in that regard, that's also the extent to which we should try to speak positively. Before the Kohen comes, he commands that the house should be entirely emptied. Because once he comes and sees the discoloration, it's possible that right then and there, it will be declared tzaras. Which means that not only is the house, the actual structure, impure, but anything in it is also impure. And so, if we take everything out of the house before that adjudication is made, regardless of how obvious it might be to people who are correctly identifying it as tzaras, again, it doesn't matter, the Kohen didn't say yet that it is tzaras, it is not yet tzaras. So therefore, if we take everything out of the house, and when he comes and he sees, and yes, he says it's tzaras, yes, the house, the structure is impure, but there's nothing in the house, and therefore all of those things are not impure. They were saved, as it were. On its face, it sounds like a very smart thing, because all the stuff that's in the house, you don't want to have to try to save, right? If it becomes impure, then that's bad. Except that when we look at the laws of impurity and the requirements of purification, it actually doesn't turn out to be as bad as we might initially think. First and foremost, other vessels made out of metal, vessels made out of bone, vessels made out of all sorts of other kinds of materials, can be purified. So let's say we don't empty the house, the Kohen comes, it is tzaras, and he immediately says that it's tzaras, and everything in the house becomes impure. All of those vessels can be purified, even though they were deemed impure because of this whole thing with tzaras. Furthermore, a person is not prohibited from being impure or from having impure things. He's prohibited from, for example, entering the temple when he's impure, or eating tithing if he's a Kohen or something while he's impure, or while there are vessels that are impure. That's a prohibition. But there's nothing inherently prohibited about being impure. So what's the problem with keeping all of these things inside of the house, even if it means that they will eventually be deemed impure by the Kohen who comes to adjudicate the possible tzaras? There is one thing, however, that cannot be purified, and that is the earthenware vessel. Earthenware vessels, the Torah tells us, cannot be purified. The only thing that one can do once an earthenware vessel is deemed impure is to break it. Therefore, the Torah requires that all of the possessions that the person has in his house be taken out of the house, even though they themselves either have a rectification in that they can be purified even if deemed impure, or they can just remain impure, and that's fine too, because the earthenware vessel, you have nothing to do with it once it is impure. So for the sake of the earthenware vessel, we have to basically schlep the entire house out of the house, all the possessions in the house out of the house. Doesn't seem like a worthwhile endeavor. Hours of labor to move the stuff out just for some tchotchkes that are very, very cheap, and earthenware vessels are the cheapest things you can get. But the fact is that everything that is in the possession of a person is a material resource that God has entrusted in him or with him in order to serve God. And so, as cheap as it might be, as not so significant in comparison to other vessels or other things that he has in the house, even the earthenware vessel has to be taken care of, has to be, paid attention to, lest it become impure, and then it can no longer be used to serve God. If indeed the discoloration seems to be tzaras, the priest quarantines the home for up to 3 weeks. Depending on the spread of the discoloration, the home is either declared to be pure, or the specified stones are removed from the house, or, in the most extreme situation, the house is demolished. The verse there says, V'chiltzu es ha'avonim, and they shall remove the stones that have the discoloration in them, or the disease, in them. Who's the they? The house is owned by a person. Up until that verse, it's all been in the singular. The person who has the house goes to the Kohen and says, I think, or it seems to me, all in the singular. All of a sudden, it's time to remove some of the stones, and it's in the plural. This is a reference to a person's neighbor. Our sages tell us, and the law is, that the neighbor is supposed to assist the owner of the home in removing the stones that have the discoloration. By the way, if tzaras was anything along the lines of leprosy, we would never have a commandment from the Torah that people have to be around and be touching and involved in leprosy, right? The whole idea, if it's actual leprosy, is to stay as far away from the leper as possible, lest the healthy person, become a leper himself. But nevertheless here, the neighbor is to assist. This is based on the concept of what's called arvus, interconnectedness, interrelationship responsibility. The sages tell us that Kol Yisrael, all of the Jewish people, orevim ze lo ze, are responsible one for the other. And as much as I might not be the one who has tzaras on my house because I wasn't gossiping, the guy next door who does, and who might have been, he's a part of me and I'm a part of him. I'm responsible for him and he's responsible for me. Therefore, I have to help. Interestingly enough, there is another version of that statement from the sages that reads a little bit differently but translates completely differently. Instead of Kol Yisrael orevim ze lo ze, that all the Jewish people are responsible one for each other, or one for another, the statement is Kol Yisrael orevim ze bo ze. All of the Jewish people are mixed one from the other. And so the reason for both versions is because on the legal side, on the simple level, everybody is responsible one for the other. On the deeper spiritual level of things, we are responsible for each other because spiritually we are intermingled, we are intertwined. We have a literal piece of God within us. But God doesn't have distinction or division. There's one God. And so the peace of God that's within me is the very same peace of God that's within anybody else. Therefore, spiritually, we're intermingled, and hence we are responsible one for the other. The Torah then describes the purification process for such a home, which is very similar to the initial stage of the purification of the human afflicted with tzaras described in the fifth aliyah. The fifth aliyah. After concluding the subject of tzaras, the Torah discusses the ritual impurity of a man who issues a sickly and unnatural seminal discharge, as well as the method by which this person attains purity when the condition passes. The sixth aliyah, this section discusses the ritual impurity contracted by a man who issues a normal seminal discharge, the ritual impurity of a menstruating woman, and of a man who cohabits with her. All such people must immerse in a mikveh in order to be purified. Once again, these are all examples of where reality fell short of potential, hence imparting impurity. They could have produced a child in all of these scenarios, but they didn't. And in that sense, it is a reality falling short of potential. The seventh aliyah. Under certain circumstances, a menstruating woman was required to bring to the temple 2 bird offerings in order to attain purity. These sacrifices are described in this section. The Haftarah in a nutshell. Obviously, the main thrust of the Parsha is about tzaras, is about this disease which, let's say, is called leprosy. But more specifically, that there is a positive end to the initially negative experience of tzaras. The Haftarah is all about the same thing. Initially, there are people who have tzaras, but specifically because they have tzaras, they are able to effectuate a salvation for the Jewish people.